The voicemail came in at 6:52 a.m., the morning after Christmas. I remember the time because I was already awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the heat kick on and off in my apartment like it couldn't decide whether to commit. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't reach for it right away. Something in my body already knew this wasn't going to be a normal message. It was my mother's voice, controlled, careful. The voice she used when she wanted something, but didn't want to sound like she was asking. "Claire and Michael have made a decision," she said. "We'll explain later. Don't react emotionally. Just call us back. No Merry Christmas. No how are you. Just a decision. Already made. Without me." My name is Eleanor Price. I was 31 years old when my family decided I was no longer part of the future they were building. At that point in my life, I had done everything the right way. Or at least the way I'd been taught was right. I lived in Hartford, Connecticut, worked as a compliance manager for a mid-sized insurance firm downtown, and paid my bills on time. I didn't have kids. I wasn't married. I didn't ask for help. I was the dependable one. My younger sister Claire was 3 years behind me, and somehow always one crisis away from disaster. When she was 24, she dropped out of nursing school. At 26, she moved back home after a failed engagement. At 29, she announced she was pregnant and getting married in the same breath, as if the order didn't matter. My parents adjusted around her like gravity shifted. They always had. Growing up, I learned early that love in our family came with conditions. Not spoken ones, practical ones. Be useful. Be agreeable. Don't complicate things. I internalized that lesson so well that by the time I graduated college, it felt like character, not conditioning. When my grandmother Ruth passed away 2 years earlier, I flew in early for the funeral and stayed late to help my parents organize paperwork. Grandma Ruth had been the only person in my family who ever spoke to me like I had agency. She used to say, "You see things clearly, Ellie. Don't let them decide for you." I didn't understand what she meant then. After the service, my father Martin pulled me aside in the kitchen while everyone else was in the living room eating casseroles and pretending nothing had changed. "You don't need to worry about the estate," he said, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Everything's taken care of." I nodded. That was my role. Nod. Trust. Move on. I didn't ask about the will. I didn't ask about the house. I didn't ask why my sister suddenly started talking about expanding her wedding budget 6 months later. I should have. Back to the voicemail. I didn't return the call right away. I got dressed, made coffee, watched the sky lighten over the parking lot outside my building. Somewhere between the first sip and the second, I felt something settle into place. Not fear, not anger, distance. By the time I called back, I was already braced. My mother answered on the first ring. "We're all together," she said. "Your father's here. Claire too." Of course they were. "What's the decision?" I asked. There was a pause, papers shifting, someone clearing their throat. "We've decided to transfer the house," my father said. "The family home. To Claire." I said nothing. "She needs stability," my mother added quickly. "With the baby coming. You understand." The house. The one my grandmother had lived in for 40 years. The one she told me, more than once, would be a safety net for the girls. "When?" I asked. "We already started the process," my father said. It made sense to do it before the new year. I looked down at my coffee. It had gone cold. "And the will?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Your grandmother's wishes were flexible," my father said. "We interpreted them as best we could." Interpreted. I thanked them for letting me know. My voice sounded steady, even to me. After the call ended, I sat at my small kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long time. There was no dramatic moment, no urge to scream. Just the slow realization that something fundamental had been taken from me without my consent. Not the house, the choice. By the end of that week, the family group chat went silent around me. Photos were shared without explanation. Wedding plans progressed. A date was set. March. Early spring. Quick. I wasn't asked to be part of anything. At work, I received a promotion I'd been quietly working toward for 2 years. My manager congratulated me. My coworkers clapped politely in the conference room. I smiled and thanked them, feeling strangely detached from my own success. That night, I drove to my parents' house unannounced. The porch light was on. Claire's car was in the driveway. Inside, boxes were stacked in the hallway. Moving boxes, labeled with Sharpie: nursery, guest room, office. My mother looked startled when she saw me. "You should have called," she said. "I know," I replied. Claire didn't come out of the living room. I could hear her laughing on the phone. Planning something. Celebrating something. I asked my father one question. "Did Grandma leave anything to me?" He didn't answer right away. That was my answer. I left without raising my voice, without demanding explanations, without tears. But as I drove back to my apartment, something finally cracked open. It wasn't grief, it was clarity. Because I understood then that what I had always called love in my family had never been love at all. It had been control, and the moment they decided, for me, without me, was the moment they lost something they didn't realize they depended on: my silence. I just hadn't told them yet. I didn't go back to my parents' house after that night, not out of anger, not out of spite. I simply stopped inserting myself where I clearly wasn't needed. For the first time, I let their silence exist, without rushing to fill it. That turned out to be harder than I expected. The next few weeks unfolded exactly as they always had, just without me in the frame. Claire's wedding plans accelerated. My mother posted photos online of paint swatches and baby clothes. My father sent emails to extended family about exciting changes and new beginnings. No one mentioned my grandmother. No one mentioned the house. No one mentioned me. At work, I threw myself into my new role. Compliance had always suited me. Rules, systems, documentation. I liked knowing where authority lived and how it was supposed to be used. I liked the idea that things worked best when people followed what was written instead of what was convenient. That irony didn't escape me. One afternoon in early January, I was reviewing a routine policy audit when a line caught my attention. A small discrepancy. A missing cross-reference. Something that didn't belong. I fixed it in under 5 minutes. But the feeling stayed. That night, I pulled out the manila envelope I'd brought home from my grandmother's funeral 2 years earlier. I hadn't opened it since. It contained sympathy cards, a copy of the funeral program, and one folded piece of paper my grandmother had slipped into my purse a few weeks before she died. I remembered the moment clearly. "You're the organized one," she'd said, pressing it into my hand. "Hold on to this." I unfolded it carefully at my kitchen table. It wasn't a will. It wasn't instructions. It was a note. "Ellie, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain things properly. Ask questions. Don't assume silence means nothing was left to you. Love, Grandma." My chest tightened. Ask questions. I realized then how thoroughly I'd been trained not to. The next morning, I called the probate court in New Haven. I told the clerk my name and my grandmother's. I asked, calmly, if I could request a copy of the filed will. There was no drama on the other end of the line, just typing, papers shuffling. "Yes," the clerk said. "I can email that to you." Within an hour, it arrived. I read it once, then again, then a third time, slower. My grandmother had left the house in trust. Not directly to either daughter, not directly to either granddaughter. A trust, split evenly between Claire and me. My name was there, in black and white. So was the executor. My father. I sat back in my chair, the document trembling slightly in my hands. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't flexible interpretation. This was a decision. I didn't call my parents. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I scheduled a consultation. Her name was Denise Walker, a state attorney, mid-40s, calm voice, direct questions, no theatrics. I slid the will across her desk and waited. She read it carefully. "Did you consent to any changes?" she asked. "No." "Did you receive notice of trust dissolution or property transfer?" "No." She nodded once. "Then you have a problem," she said. And so do they. I felt something shift. Not relief, not triumph. Momentum. Denise explained my options. Trust accounting, asset tracing, formal demand. All procedural, all documented, all quiet. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to know where my half went," I said. She smiled slightly. "That's a good place to start. By the time I left her office, my hands were steady. The formal request went out the following week. Certified mail, neutral language, a simple demand for trust records and transaction history. My parents received it on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, my phone lit up. My mother called first. "What is this?" she demanded. "Why are you involving lawyers?" "I asked a question," I said. "You didn't answer." "This is unnecessary," she said. "We were going to explain everything." "When?" I asked. Silence. My father called next. "You're making a mistake," he said. "This will complicate things." "Things were already complicated," I replied. "You don't need the money," he said. "You're doing fine." That was the moment. Not when I saw my name missing from the house paperwork, not when they announced the transfer, but when he decided what I needed. I ended the call without another word. 2 days later, Claire sent me a message. "Why are you doing this now? You're stressing Mom out." "I'm pregnant. This isn't the time." I stared at the screen. Then I deleted the message. By the end of January, Denise received partial records. Incomplete, redacted, selective. Enough to show movement. Enough to show intent. Large withdrawals. Property refinancing. Funds redirected into accounts I didn't recognize. Not gifts, transfers. Denise looked at me across her desk. "They didn't just bypass you," she said. "They erased you." I nodded. Outside, snow fell softly onto the sidewalk. The world looked calm, normal. Inside me, something hardened. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt resolved. Because whatever story my family was telling themselves, whatever narrative they were sharing at wedding tastings and baby showers, it was built on something they assumed I would never touch. Paperwork. And paperwork, I had learned, tells the truth, whether people like it or not. By the time February arrived, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They thought I would stay quiet. They were wrong. And they were about to find out in a way that didn't involve shouting, tears, or forgiveness. Just facts. The first official response from my parents' attorney arrived on a Friday afternoon, neatly timed for maximum inconvenience. Denise forwarded it to me with no commentary, just the attachment. I opened it at my desk, long after most of my coworkers had gone home. Outside the office windows, Hartford was already dark, winter pressing its face against the glass. The letter was polite, measured, almost friendly. It claimed there had been no wrongdoing, that the trust had been managed in good faith, that certain decisions had been made to preserve family stability during a sensitive transition. It offered no accounting, no documentation, no explanation for why the property had been transferred outright to Claire. At the bottom was a single line that made my jaw tighten. Any further action may result in unnecessary conflict within the family. That was the warning. I forwarded the letter back to Denise with one sentence. They didn't answer the question. Her reply came quickly. Then we ask it louder. Legally. The formal petition was filed the following Monday. Petition for trust accounting and injunctive relief. Dense language. Precise citations. No emotion. Once it was on record, everything changed. My parents stopped calling. Instead, the extended family began to surface. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years left a voicemail about forgiveness. A cousin messaged me on Facebook, asking why I was doing this to everyone right before the wedding. A family friend sent a long email about how my grandmother wouldn't have wanted conflict. None of them asked what I wanted. None of them asked what had actually happened. They just wanted it to stop. That was the pressure point my family had always relied on. The collective discomfort. The unspoken rule that whoever disrupted the peace was at fault, regardless of why. This time, I didn't respond. Denise advised me not to. "Silence isn't avoidance," she said. "It's containment." The court scheduled a preliminary hearing for early March, 3 weeks before Claire's wedding. That timing wasn't lost on anyone. At work, I started noticing things I'd never allowed myself to see before. How often I softened my language. How often I volunteered to absorb risk so others could stay comfortable. How deeply that instinct ran. It hadn't come from nowhere. On a Tuesday evening, my mother showed up at my apartment without warning. I watched her through the peephole for a long moment before opening the door. She looked smaller than usual, wrapped tightly in her coat, lips pressed together like she was bracing for impact. "You didn't answer my messages," she said, stepping inside without being invited. I know. She sat on the edge of my couch, hands folded. This is spiraling, she said. Your father is under a lot of stress. I leaned against the kitchen counter and waited. You have to understand, she continued. Claire needs the house, the baby, the wedding. It all happened so fast. And I didn't, I said. She frowned. What does that mean? It means you decided I didn't need anything because I wasn't in crisis. Her eyes flickered. Not denial, recognition. That's not fair, she said quietly. No, I agreed. It's not. She looked around my apartment, taking in the neatness, the order, the life I'd built without help. You're strong, she said. You always have been. There it was. The justification. Strength isn't consent, I said. Her shoulders sagged slightly. You're forcing us into a corner, she said. You put me there first, I replied. She stood abruptly, anger flashing through the fatigue. If you go through with this, she said, don't expect things to go back to how they were. I met her gaze. They already didn't. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet and felt something unfamiliar. Not guilt, grief. Not for what I was losing, but for what I had never actually had. A week later, Denise received a partial accounting. It was sloppy, incomplete, and damning. The trust had been dissolved 6 months after my grandmother's death. No notice sent to me. The house had been refinanced, equity extracted, then transferred to Claire outright. The proceeds had funded wedding deposits, renovations, and a down payment on a new SUV, all under my father's authority as executor. Denise tapped the page with her pen. This crosses from civil into personal liability, she said. Potentially criminal. I exhaled slowly. I don't want revenge, I said. I want restoration. She nodded. That's exactly what the court is for. The hearing arrived faster than I expected. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined. More administrative than dramatic. A judge with tired eyes, lawyers with stacks of paper. My parents sitting together, not looking at me. Claire wasn't there. Her attorney was. When my father's lawyer spoke, he framed everything as urgency, as family necessity, as choices made under pressure. When Denise spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She simply laid out dates, amounts, signatures. The judge listened. At the end, he issued a temporary injunction. No further transfer of the property. No sale, no refinancing. Full accounting ordered within 30 days. Claire's wedding was now entangled in court orders. As we exited the courtroom, my father finally looked at me. You could have handled this privately, he said. I tried, I replied. Outside, reporters waited. Not many, just enough to notice. I didn't speak. That night, Claire called. I almost didn't answer. You're ruining my life, she said immediately. No greeting, no hesitation. I didn't take anything from you, I replied. You're taking everything, she snapped. The house, the wedding, Mom's health. I paused. You built all of that on something that wasn't yours, I said. That doesn't make me the villain. She hung up. 2 days later, the wedding venue canceled. A conflict of funds clause. The date disappeared from the website. Invitations stopped arriving. And for the first time since this began, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about punishing them. It was about ending a pattern that only worked as long as I stayed quiet. And now that the silence was gone, everything they'd built on it was starting to crack. The first thing that broke wasn't the wedding. It was the illusion that my parents still controlled the story. Once the injunction was filed, things moved in ways they couldn't manage with phone calls and emotional pressure. Lawyers spoke to lawyers. Banks spoke to courts. Documents surfaced that no one could explain away with tone or intent. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting. I was watching. Claire moved back into my parents' house the week after the venue canceled. I didn't hear that directly from them. I heard it from a neighbor who still sent me Christmas cards every year and thought she was being helpful. She's been crying a lot, the woman said. Your mother looks exhausted. I thanked her and hung up. Exhaustion wasn't evidence of innocence. Denise called me in for a meeting the following Monday. They've complied partially with the accounting order, she said, sliding a thick folder across her desk. Enough to make things worse for themselves. I opened it slowly. There it was. Invoices, bank statements, wire transfers. Trust funds moved into personal accounts. Personal accounts funding wedding expenses, home renovations, and a business loan I'd never heard of. Business loan? I asked. Denise nodded. Your father co-signed something last year. Used the house as leverage after refinancing. The house. My grandmother's house. The one that was supposed to be preserved in trust. I felt my jaw tighten, but my voice stayed level. For what business? Denise flipped a page. A limited liability company in Claire's name, she said. Interior design. On paper. On paper. Is it real? I asked. It exists, Denise replied. Whether it functions is another question. I closed the folder. This wasn't mismanagement. This was extraction. Denise leaned back in her chair. They assumed you wouldn't look, she said. Or that if you did, you'd stop once things got uncomfortable. They were right before, I said. She smiled faintly. Not anymore. The court scheduled a second hearing for mid-March. This one wasn't procedural. It was evaluative. The judge wanted explanations. Claire didn't come to that one either. Her attorney did. He argued necessity, family obligation, claimed Claire had relied in good faith on her parents' assurances, that she hadn't known the trust was split. Denise didn't argue. She presented emails, not angry ones, practical ones. Messages from my father to contractors discussing family equity. Notes about timing transfers before Ellie asks questions. Calendar reminders titled Finalize Claire House Docs. The judge read quietly, thoroughly. At one point, he looked up at my father. Did you inform your elder daughter that she was a beneficiary of this trust? He asked. My father hesitated. No, he said. Why not? He glanced briefly at my mother. She didn't need it. The judge paused. Need is not the standard, he said. Duty is. The room went very still. That afternoon, the court ordered a forensic audit. Independent. Comprehensive. It meant delays. It meant exposure. It meant nothing could be hidden behind family language anymore. Claire called me that night. I let it ring twice before answering. Do you hate me that much? She asked. No, I said. Then why are you doing this? She snapped. Why won't you just let it go? I thought about the house. The trust, the loan, the way my life had always been positioned as optional. I'm not doing this to you, I said. I'm doing this because of what you accepted. She laughed bitterly. You always think you're better than us. That's not true, I replied. I just stopped pretending I was less. She went quiet. I'm pregnant, she said softly, like it was a shield. I know, I replied. You're really going to let this blow up with a baby coming? I closed my eyes for a moment. You built this around a baby, I said. That doesn't make it untouchable. She hung up without another word. At work, my performance review came in. Exceeds expectations. Recommendation for leadership track. My manager mentioned my composure under pressure. I almost laughed. Pressure changes when you stop trying to be liked. By the end of March, the audit report was delivered. Denise called me as soon as she received it. They moved more than we thought, she said. And not just once. How bad? I asked. She paused. Bad enough that the court may remove your father as executor retroactively. I sat down at my kitchen table. And the house? Subject to reversal, she said. Or forced sale, with proceeds split. My grandmother's voice came back to me then. Clear. Calm. Don't let them decide for you. For the first time, I felt like I was honoring her. Not with anger. With precision. The wedding date came and went, quietly. No photos. No announcements. No celebration. Claire deleted the website. My parents stopped posting entirely. The story they'd been telling had run out of places to hide. And the closer the court got to the final decision, the more obvious something became. They hadn't just underestimated me. They'd built their entire future on the belief that I would never push back. They were wrong. And the reckoning wasn't coming with yelling or revenge. It was coming with signatures, orders, and consequences they could no longer manage. The audit didn't just expose numbers. It exposed habits. That was what stayed with me as April began. Not the dollar amounts, though they were significant. Not even the legal violations, though they were undeniable. It was the pattern. Years of small, quiet decisions that all leaned in the same direction. Away from me. Denise invited me into her office the morning after the audit summary was filed with the court. She didn't soften it. They treated the trust like a private line of credit, she said. And they did it consistently. I sat across from her, hands folded, listening. The house was refinanced twice, she continued. The first time to clear your parents' personal debt. The second time to fund Claire's wedding deposits and her LLC's startup costs. None of this was disclosed. None of it was authorized. And my half? I asked. Denise looked at me carefully. Your share was never segregated, she said. On paper, it existed. In practice, it was spent. I nodded slowly. So that was it. Not just exclusion. Erasure. The court responded faster than expected. Within a week, my father was formally removed as executor. A neutral fiduciary was appointed to unwind the trust and assess restitution. The language in the order was blunt. Breach of duty, failure to disclose, improper self-dealing. Seeing those words attached to my father's name felt surreal. This was the man who used to lecture me about responsibility, about planning ahead, about doing things the right way. At no point did I feel satisfaction. What I felt was distance. Claire finally showed up in person 2 days later. I was leaving work when I saw her standing near my car in the parking garage. Her hair was pulled back too tightly. Her coat hung open despite the chill. She looked like she hadn't slept. "We need to talk," she said. I checked my watch. "I have 10 minutes, I replied. She crossed her arms, immediately defensive. "You really don't care what happens to us, do you?" I didn't answer right away. "I care about what's real," I said. "Not what you need me to absorb." She scoffed. "You always act like you're above this." "I'm not above it," I said. "I'm just done being underneath it." Her eyes flashed. "You're going to force them to sell the house," she said. "You know that, right?" "I know the court will decide," I replied. "Based on facts. That house is my baby's home." "That house was Grandma's," I said evenly, "and half of it was mine." She looked away, jaw tight. "You could still stop this," she said. "Tell your lawyer to ease off. We could work something out." I studied her face, the fear, the calculation, the expectation that I would once again be the release valve. "What would working something out look like?" I asked. She hesitated. "You walking away," she said quietly. There it was. "No," I replied. Her shoulders sagged. For a brief moment, she looked exactly like she had as a kid, when she realized tantrums weren't working. "You're really going to choose money over family?" she said. I met her eyes. "I'm choosing truth over manipulation," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." She left without another word. The sale order came at the end of April. The court ruled that the house had to be listed. Market value. No private transfer. Proceeds to be split after liabilities were settled. Claire's LLC loan was called in. The SUV was flagged as an asset purchased with trust funds. The illusion of stability collapsed all at once. My parents' attorney requested mediation. Denise asked me what I wanted. "I want closure," I said. On paper. The mediation session was tense, but brief. My parents tried to frame everything as mistakes made under pressure. My mother cried. My father apologized in general terms, careful not to admit intent. I didn't respond emotionally. I responded structurally. The settlement required restitution, not just of my share of the house, but of funds diverted elsewhere. Payment plans, asset liquidation, oversight. My parents signed. They didn't look at me while they did. By early May, the house went on the market. The sign in the yard felt symbolic in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not a victory, an ending. I drove by once. Just once. The porch where my grandmother used to sit in the evenings looked smaller than I remembered. The windows reflected the sky, indifferent to who owned them. I didn't stop. At work, I was asked to lead a compliance review team. Temporary assignment. High visibility. I accepted. It felt appropriate. Claire stopped contacting me entirely. My mother sent one final message. "You didn't have to go this far." I didn't reply. Because far wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time in my life, I hadn't bent to preserve an image that cost me everything. And as May turned towards summer, I realized something quietly profound. The worst had already happened. They'd already taken what they could. What was left was mine. By June, the house had an offer. Full price. Cash. It closed faster than anyone expected, which felt fitting. That house had carried too much quiet history to linger on the market. It was ready to be done, just like I was. Denise called me the morning the sale finalized. "The proceeds will be held in escrow until liens and liabilities are settled," she said. "Your share will be clean. No encumbrances." I thanked her and hung up. then sat at my desk for a long moment without opening my email. I wasn't relieved. I was recalibrating. For so long, my nervous system had been trained to anticipate the next demand, the next emotional negotiation, the next request disguised as concern. Without that constant pressure, the silence felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. That's when the second betrayal surfaced. It arrived in the form of a certified notice from a regional bank I'd never done business with. I opened it that evening at home, standing in my kitchen, one hand on the counter. Notice of delinquency. Outstanding balance, $87,000. Account holder, Eleanor Price. My name. My social security number, not my signature. I didn't panic. That surprised me. Instead, I felt a slow, cold focus settle in. I called Denise immediately. "They opened credit in your name," she said, after reviewing the documents. "Likely during the same window as the trust transfers." "Without my consent," I said. "Yes," she replied. "Which moves this beyond civil." That was the moment the story changed. Again. Not escalated. Clarified. The family narrative had always been about redistribution. About who needed what more. About urgency and fairness and sacrifice. This wasn't that. This was identity theft. Denise looped in a colleague. Federal jurisdiction. Clean paper trail. Electronic signatures traced to an IP address registered to my parents' home. My father's home. I thought of every lecture he'd ever given me about credit. About responsibility. About planning for the future. I felt nothing. The criminal complaint was filed quietly. No drama. No announcement. My parents found out when an investigator showed up at their door. My mother called me that night. She didn't accuse. She didn't plead. She sounded tired. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "I didn't," I said. "I reported a crime." Silence stretched between us. "He was trying to help," she said finally. "No," I replied. "He was trying to control." That was the last conversation we had. Claire sent one message, 2 days later. "Dad could go to jail. Are you happy now?" I stared at the words until they lost shape. Then I deleted them. At work, I kept everything separate. No one knew what was happening unless they needed to. I showed up, I led meetings, I delivered results. Control feels different when it's yours. The investigator assigned to the case interviewed me the following week. Methodical, calm, professional. "Did you authorize any lines of credit in the last 3 years?" he asked. "No." "Did you provide login access to your parents?" "No." He nodded and made notes. "This is clean," he said. "Which makes it ugly." I understood what he meant. By July, restitution from the trust sale cleared. My share landed in my account on a Tuesday morning. I looked at the number once, verified it, then closed the app. Money wasn't the point anymore. Agency was. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. My father's attorney reached out, requesting a meeting. Denise advised against it. "Let the system work," she said. "You've already done enough." So I let it. I stopped checking public records, stopped driving past the old house, stopped bracing for contact that never came. And in that space, something unexpected happened. I started imagining a future that wasn't reactive, not a recovery, a direction. Late one evening, I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker on, and thought about my grandmother again, about how she'd seen this coming, about how quietly she'd tried to protect me. I understood her now. Love, in its healthiest form, doesn't ask you to disappear so others can remain comfortable. It asks you to stand. And for the first time in my life, I was standing without waiting for permission. But the case wasn't over yet, and the final confrontation wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be procedural, which, I was learning, was far more devastating. The arraignment was scheduled for the second week of August. I didn't plan to attend. Denise had told me I didn't need to, that my presence wouldn't change the facts. But the night before, I realized something important. This wasn't about influence. It was about witnessing the end of something I'd spent my entire life carrying. So I went. The courthouse was smaller than the one downtown. Functional. Beige walls, fluorescent lights that flattened everyone equally. My parents sat on the far side of the room, not together this time. My mother stared straight ahead, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. My father sat rigid, eyes fixed on the floor. He looked older, smaller, less certain. That, more than anything, unsettled me. The charges were read plainly: identity theft, fraudulent use of personal identifying information, financial exploitation. There was no story, no context, no room for interpretation, just dates, numbers, actions. My father entered a not guilty plea. His attorney requested time to review discovery. The judge granted it without expression. I watched my parents leave separately, my mother exiting first, without looking back. My father followed several minutes later, his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen. I didn't approach either of them. Outside, the air was thick with late summer heat. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting the noise of traffic ground me. I felt lighter, not vindicated, unburdened. At work, I was assigned to oversee an internal audit tied to vendor compliance. High risk, high visibility. Exactly the kind of thing that would have terrified me a year earlier. Now, it felt natural. When you've survived people who know your weaknesses, spreadsheets don't scare you. The trial date was set for October. In the meantime, my parents' world continued to constrict. Their accounts were frozen pending investigation. My mother resigned from her volunteer board for health reasons. Claire's LLC quietly dissolved after the bank called in the loan. The ripple effects were not subtle. I heard about them secondhand, through distant relatives, through acquaintances who suddenly found reasons to mention my name carefully, like it might crack under pressure. None of it moved me. What surprised me most was how quickly the noise faded once I stopped responding to it. Silence, I learned, starves manipulation. In early September, Denise called with an update. "They're asking for a plea discussion," she said. "Your father's attorney reached out to the prosecutor." I closed my eyes. "On what terms?" I asked. "Reduced charges in exchange for restitution and admission," she said. "Probation likely, no jail." I thought about that. Not emotionally, logistically. "Will my credit be cleared?" I asked. "Yes." "And oversight?" I added. "Mandatory," she said. "No financial authority for several years." "That's enough," I replied. The plea was entered 2 weeks later. I didn't attend that hearing. I didn't need to. Denise summarized it for me in a single email. He accepted responsibility. Restitution ordered. Credit restored. Probation imposed. I read it once and archived it. The case that had quietly shaped my entire life ended with no ceremony. That felt appropriate. Claire tried one last time after that. She showed up at my apartment on a Sunday afternoon, unannounced, her face drawn, her eyes sharp with resentment she hadn't fully processed. "You really let him take the fall," she said. "I didn't invite her in." "He didn't fall," I replied. "He acted." "You could have stopped it," she said. "You always could." I met her gaze. "That's the problem," I said. "You thought I always would." She laughed bitterly. "You think you won," she said. I shook my head. "This isn't about winning," I said. "It's about not losing myself again." She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. I closed the door gently. That night, I sat alone in my living room, lights low, and thought about everything that had shifted. My family hadn't changed. I had. I no longer explained my decisions. I no longer absorbed other people's panic. I no longer mistook endurance for love. In October, my credit report was corrected, the false account removed, my score restored. A clean line where there had once been damage done quietly, without my consent. I printed the confirmation and filed it away, not as a trophy, as a record, because that was who I was now. Someone who kept records, someone who didn't rely on memory or promises or guilt, someone who understood that power doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from clarity, and clarity, once gained, doesn't fade. The trial was over. The house was gone. The family dynamic that had defined me for 3 decades had collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions. What remained was simple, a life that belonged to me. And for the first time, I wasn't preparing to defend it. I was preparing to live it. Once the case ended, people expected something from me. Relief, celebration, anger finally released. Some kind of visible reaction that would make sense of everything that had happened. What they didn't expect was how quiet it became. Not externally, internally. For weeks after the plea deal, my life felt almost eerily normal. I went to work, I cooked dinner, I slept through the night without jolting awake to check my phone. The constant low-level vigilance I'd carried for years simply stopped. That absence took some getting used to. In early November, Denise invited me to her office one last time. Not for paperwork, not for strategy. Closure. She handed me a final packet. Restitution confirmations, court orders, credit restoration notices. Everything stamped, dated, final. You did this the hard way, she said. Most people don't. I gave a small smile. I didn't know there was another option. There is, she said. It just costs more in the long run. As I stood to leave, she paused. Eleanor, she said, if you ever doubt yourself again, read these. Facts, don't gaslight. I thanked her and walked out into the cold. Thanksgiving came and went without my family. That was new. For the first time in my life, I didn't negotiate where I would be, who I would sit next to, or how to keep the peace. I made reservations at a small restaurant near the river and went alone. The server asked if I was waiting for anyone. No, I said. Just me. She smiled like that was perfectly acceptable. It was. On my way home, I drove past my parents' old neighborhood without meaning to. The house was dark. The for sale sign was gone. Someone else lived there now. Lights on, curtains drawn. I didn't feel sadness. I felt distance. In December, my company announced a restructuring. 2 departments merged. Leadership positions opened. My name came up in conversations I wasn't part of. When my manager called me into her office and offered me the role, she didn't reference my performance under pressure. She didn't mention resilience. She said something else instead. You don't hesitate, she said. You assess. Then, you act. I accepted. That promotion changed more than my title. It changed how people interacted with me. Fewer assumptions. Fewer attempts to redirect responsibility. Respect has a way of following boundaries. A week before Christmas, my mother sent a letter. Handwritten. Careful. Polite. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She wrote about the weather. About how strange the house felt without noise. About how my father was adjusting. At the end, she wrote, I hope one day we can talk again. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not unread. Unanswered. Some conversations don't need to happen to be complete. Christmas morning was quiet. I made coffee, watched snow fall in thin, deliberate lines. I didn't feel lonely. I felt grounded. Later that day, I received a message from Claire's former fiancé. Short, unexpected. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't see it until it was too late, I replied once. You saw it when it mattered. Then I let it go. As the year ended, I found myself thinking less about what had been taken and more about what had been returned. Not the money. The authority. For most of my life, decisions had been made around me, for me, despite me. I had mistaken that pattern for love, for protection, for family. Now I could see it clearly. It had never been about care. It had been about access. Access to my compliance, my silence, my resources. And once that access was revoked, everything else fell apart. In the quiet between Christmas and New Year's, I started looking at houses. Not urgently, not emotionally, practically. I toured a small place on the edge of town. Nothing dramatic, solid, affordable. Mine. Standing in the empty living room, I felt something unfamiliar. Choice without consequence. No one to consult. No one to appease. Just me. I didn't make an offer that day, but I knew I would. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't building my future around someone else's expectations. I was building it around truth. And truth, I had learned, doesn't need witnesses to be real. It just needs to be honored. I signed the purchase agreement in late January. It wasn't the house I would have chosen years ago, back when I still measured my life against my family's approval. It didn't have dramatic bones or an address meant to impress anyone. It was a modest 2-story on a quiet street near the edge of town, close enough to the river to smell it in the mornings. It felt right. The inspection went smoothly. The appraisal came in clean. There were no complications, no hidden clauses, no one else's name anywhere near the paperwork. That mattered more than the square footage. I closed on a Thursday morning. Snow flurries drifted past the windows of the title office as I signed my name again and again, each signature deliberate. When the agent slid the keys across the table, she smiled. Congratulations, she said. You did this on your own. I thanked her, then sat in my car afterward longer than necessary, keys heavy in my palm. For years, I'd believed independence meant isolation, that doing things alone was something you accepted when no one showed up for you. I understood now how wrong that was. This wasn't isolation, it was authorship. Moving in took time. I didn't rush. I wanted each decision to be intentional. Where the couch went, what color the walls would be, what I would keep and what I would leave behind. The first thing I unpacked wasn't furniture. It was the file, the one Denise had told me to keep. The one that held every document, every ruling, every confirmation. I placed it in a drawer in my home office and closed it without ceremony. Not to forget, to finish. At work, my new role settled into a rhythm. Meetings, reviews, decisions that carried real weight. I noticed something subtle in how people spoke to me now. They didn't explain things twice. They didn't assume I would defer. They waited. That felt new. In March, I ran into my father unexpectedly. It happened at a grocery store not far from my new house. I turned down an aisle, and there he was, studying labels like the answer might be printed there. He looked thinner, older, smaller than I remembered. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking. "I didn't know you moved out here," he said finally. "I didn't tell anyone," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I hope you're doing well," he said. "I am," I answered, and meant it. He hesitated. "I never thought you'd push back," he said quietly. "You always understood." I met his eyes. "I always complied," I corrected. "That's not the same thing." He swallowed. "I thought I was helping," he said. "No," I replied. "You were deciding." He nodded once, then stepped aside to let me pass. That was it. No apology, no reconciliation, no attempt to repair what couldn't be undone. And I was okay with that. Spring came early that year. I planted herbs in the small patch of yard behind the house. Basil, rosemary, mint. Practical things that required patience and attention. Tending them grounded me in a way I hadn't expected. In April, my mother sent another letter. Shorter this time. She wrote that the house felt empty, that she missed hearing my footsteps in the hallway, that she hoped I would visit someday. I read it, folded it, put it back in the envelope. Some losses are consequences, not tragedies. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. By May, the last restitution payment posted. Everything that could be returned had been returned. The balance wasn't just financial, it was internal. One evening, as I sat on my back steps watching the light fade, I realized I hadn't thought about my family in days. Not with anger, not with grief, not even with curiosity. They had receded into the background of my life, where unexamined influences belong once they no longer control the present. That was the real shift. Not justice, not closure, distance. The kind that allows you to breathe. I poured a glass of wine and thought about the woman I'd been a year earlier. The one who believed silence was safety. The one who thought being needed was the same as being valued. I wished I could tell her one thing. You're allowed to choose yourself without explaining why. I finished my wine as the stars came out, steady and indifferent. The story that once consumed me had finally loosened its grip. There was only one chapter left, not about what I lost, about what I kept. By June, my life had settled into something steady enough to trust. That, more than anything, surprised me. There were no more letters from lawyers, no updates from investigators, no quiet dread when my phone rang late in the evening. The legal chapter had closed so cleanly that it almost felt unreal. Like a door that had always been there had finally been locked and removed entirely. What remained was the aftermath you don't see in court filings, the social one. I noticed it first at work. People who had known my parents, directly or indirectly, became careful around me. Conversations paused when I entered a room. Names went unmentioned. Not out of hostility, but discomfort. The story had spread just enough to make everyone aware that something serious had happened, without anyone wanting to touch it directly. I didn't correct them. I didn't explain. Letting people sit with uncertainty was a boundary I'd never allowed myself before. That summer, my company hosted a leadership retreat in Vermont. 3 days at a converted lodge, long meetings during the day, polite dinners at night. It was meant to be bonding. It was also a test. On the second evening, after the wine had loosened everyone just enough, A colleague asked a question she clearly hadn't planned to ask out loud. "You don't talk about your family much," she said, smiling like it was harmless. "Are they far away?" I looked at her for a moment. "Yes," I said, "in every way that matters." She blinked, then nodded, unsure how to respond. The conversation moved on. That moment stayed with me, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. In the past, I would have filled the silence, softened the truth, made it easier for someone else to hear. Now I let it stand. In July, I received an unexpected call from the court-appointed fiduciary who had overseen the final trust settlement. He wanted to confirm one last detail. There was a small remainder after liabilities, he said. Not enough to warrant redistribution. Legally, it defaults to you as the remaining beneficiary. About $12,000. I thanked him. When the transfer cleared, I donated most of it to a legal aid fund that specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation cases, not as a statement, as alignment. Around that time, Claire resurfaced indirectly. A former family friend mentioned she'd moved out of state, that she was living with a cousin, that things were hard. I listened without reaction. Hard wasn't injustice. Hard was consequence. My mother tried once more at the end of August. She sent a voicemail this time, her voice careful, restrained. "I don't understand why you won't talk to me," she said. "I'm still your mother." I listened to it once. Then I deleted it. Not because it wasn't true, but because it wasn't sufficient. Being someone's child does not require unlimited access. It does not require forgiveness without accountability. It does not require proximity to harm. Those were truths I'd learned slowly, painfully, and finally, completely. In September, I was invited to speak on a panel about ethical governance and internal controls. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't tell my story. I talked about systems, about how most abuses don't start with malice, but with entitlement, about how silence, especially from capable people, is often the most valuable asset in a corrupt structure. Afterward, a woman in her late 50s approached me. She waited until the room cleared. "I needed to hear that," she said quietly. "My brother manages my mother's finances. I've always felt uneasy, but I didn't want to cause trouble." "Discomfort isn't trouble," I said. "It's information." She nodded, eyes bright with something like resolve. That night, driving home, I thought about the audience I never imagined when this all began. Women who had spent decades being told to keep things together, to not rock the boat, to be grateful instead of vigilant. I understood them now. I understood myself. By early October, my house finally felt finished. Not decorated, not staged, lived in. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes, I found a photo I hadn't seen in years. My grandmother and me, standing in front of the old house, both squinting into the sun. She had her hand on my shoulder. I placed the photo on my desk, not as nostalgia, as recognition. The woman in that picture had known exactly what she was doing when she warned me to ask questions. She had understood the cost of silence long before I did. And now, standing in a home I owned outright, a life no longer subject to negotiation, I felt the full weight of what had shifted. I was no longer reacting to my family's choices. I was no longer defined by what they took. I had become someone who noticed when power was being misused and acted accordingly, without drama, without apology. There were still 2 months left in the year, and one final chapter still unfolding. Not in court, in meaning. The email arrived on a Monday morning in late November, tucked between routine reports and meeting invites. Subject line: Notice of appearance. I almost deleted it without opening. It didn't look urgent. It didn't look personal. It looked procedural, which was why it made my stomach tighten before I even clicked. It was from a law firm in Rhode Island. They represented my grandmother's former business partner. I hadn't known she'd had one. I read the message twice before it fully landed. According to their records, my grandmother had retained a minority ownership stake in a small coastal property development years before her death. The partnership had been dormant, largely inactive, and managed quietly through a holding structure that never intersected with the family trust. Until now, the firm had been conducting its own internal review after a pending sale and discovered discrepancies tied to the period when my father was executor of my grandmother's estate. They were reaching out to the proper beneficiary, me. I forwarded the email to Denise immediately. Her response came less than an hour later. This is significant. Do not reply yet. We spoke that afternoon. The situation was, once again, quietly explosive. My grandmother's investment wasn't large in terms of public footprint, but it was valuable. Prime land, long-term appreciation, the kind of asset that didn't make noise unless someone tried to move it, which someone had. Your father attempted to assert authority over it, Denise said, after the trust dissolution. He didn't succeed, but the attempt is documented. Meaning? I asked. Meaning the pattern is broader than we thought, she said. And the exposure isn't limited to family court. I closed my eyes. Even now, even after everything, he'd tried again. The firm requested a meeting. Denise recommended we attend. We met in early December at their office overlooking the water. Two attorneys, polite, focused, unemotional. They laid out the facts carefully. My grandmother's stake had remained untouched for years. No withdrawals, no changes, no transfers. Until my father submitted documentation claiming executor authority and attempted to initiate a restructuring that would have positioned him as controlling intermediary. It didn't go through, one attorney said. The paperwork was incomplete. But the intent is clear. I felt a familiar stillness settle in. What happens now? I asked. They exchanged a glance. The partnership is dissolving, the other attorney said. Assets will be distributed. Your grandmother's share passes to you. And the attempted interference? Denise asked. That's being referred, he replied. Separately. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need the distraction. I wasn't angry. I was finished being surprised. By mid-December, the transfer was complete. The amount was substantial. More than the house proceeds. More than the restitution. Enough to change the shape of a life if mishandled. Enough to reveal who you really are. I didn't tell anyone. Not my coworkers. Not acquaintances. Not the distant relatives who had slowly begun testing the silence with polite check-ins and vague invitations. Money had been the lever used against me my entire life. I wasn't going to let it become the center of the story again. Instead, I made appointments. A financial advisor with a fiduciary oath, a tax attorney, a planner who asked hard questions and didn't flatter me. We built structures, firewalls, protections. No single point of failure. No access granted without intention. On December 23rd, my mother called again. I let it ring. She left a voicemail. It's almost Christmas, she said softly. I don't know how we got here. I did. I just didn't say it out loud anymore. That night, I wrapped a single gift for myself. Nothing expensive. A leather-bound notebook. Heavy pages. Blank. On the first page, I wrote one sentence. I decide what happens next. Christmas passed quietly. No drama, no reconciliations, no scenes, just space. And in that space, something crystallized. My father hadn't just exploited authority. He had depended on my silence to do it. Every time I chose not to respond, not to explain, not to soften the truth. That dependency weakened. By New Year's Eve, I had made a decision I hadn't anticipated when this all began. It wasn't about confronting anyone. It wasn't about public accountability. It was about finality. On January 2nd, I signed one last document. Not a complaint, not a claim, a declaration. It formalized the separation between my legal, financial, and personal life and my parents entirely. No shared authority, no implied access. No emergency clauses. Nothing left open to interpretation. As I slid the paper back across the table, the attorney nodded. This closes the door, she said. I nodded back. That's the point. I walked out into the cold afternoon air, feeling something I hadn't felt since childhood. Unencumbered. There was only one thing left. Not to confront them, not to forgive them, but to live in a way that no longer required their absence to be explained. And that realization carried me into the final chapter of this story, one that didn't belong to them at all. The first morning of the new year was quiet, in a way that felt deliberate. No messages, no notifications, no sense of bracing for impact. I woke up in my own house, sunlight moving slowly across the wall, and realized something before my feet even touched the floor. There was nothing left unresolved. For most of my life, I had lived with the belief that unfinished things were dangerous, that silence meant tension, that distance meant failure. I had been taught, carefully and repeatedly, that harmony mattered more than clarity, and that keeping the family together was a responsibility, not a choice. What no one ever said out loud was the cost. The cost was agency. The cost was safety. The cost was a future that only existed if it didn't interfere with someone else's comfort. That cost had been extracted quietly for years, one assumption at a time, until I stopped noticing the weight of it. And then one day, the weight disappeared. I didn't announce my separation from my parents. I didn't send a final message explaining my reasons in perfect, irrefutable language. I didn't block numbers out of anger or erase photos in a dramatic purge. I simply stopped participating. That was the most powerful decision I made. Life didn't become perfect after that. It became honest. At work, I settled fully into my role. Not driven by the need to prove myself, but by the satisfaction of competence. I was trusted because I was consistent. Respected because I didn't over-explain. I noticed that the same skills that once made me easy to exploit now made me effective. Boundaries don't make you colder. They make you clearer. In February, I hosted a small dinner at my house. No occasion, no holiday. Just people I had chosen. Conversation flowed easily. No one asked invasive questions. No one needed me to manage their emotions. When everyone left, I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the quiet return, and felt something close to gratitude. Not for what I had survived, for what I had learned. I thought about my grandmother often that winter, about the way she had watched the family dynamic with a kind of resigned clarity, about the trust she had created not as a gift, but as protection. She hadn't been trying to reward me. She had been trying to give me a way out. I finally understood that. The money she left behind, the assets I recovered, the restitution that followed, all of it. Those were outcomes. Important ones, necessary ones, but they weren't the ending. The ending was internal. It was the moment I stopped explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. It was the moment I accepted that love without accountability is just control with better branding. It was the moment I chose dignity over approval. I don't tell this story to warn people away from family. I tell it to remind them that being related to someone does not grant them permanent access to your life, your labor, or your silence. Betrayal doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like entitlement wrapped in concern. Revenge, in the way people usually imagine it, never interested me. There was no shouting match, no public humiliation, no dramatic confrontation that made anyone clap. What happened instead was quieter and far more lasting. I reclaimed authorship. I used the law, documentation, and distance to restore balance where manipulation had thrived. I let consequences unfold without interfering to soften them. I stopped rescuing people from the results of their own choices. That wasn't cruelty. That was respect for reality. Today, my life is smaller than it once was in terms of people, but larger in every way that matters. My home is peaceful. My finances are protected. My relationships are reciprocal. I am not waiting for anyone to understand my decisions. I understand them. And that is enough. If you're listening to this and something feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've been the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who keeps things running while everyone else takes credit, hear this clearly. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to choose yourself without making it a performance. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it signs paperwork, locks doors, and walks away. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to draw a line where love was being used as leverage, share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you want to hear more stories about family drama, betrayal, revenge, karma, and the quiet power of taking your life back, like this video and subscribe. Until next time, protect your peace.